When wolves encircled a frightened boy in the woods, no one could have predicted the astonishing twist that followed. The night pressed down heavily on the barren road, smothering the last remnants of twilight. Baron stood motionless, his small hands clutching a threadbare teddy bear to his chest. He was 5 years old, and this was the moment his world fell apart. The car that carried his parents had disappeared into the distance, its headlights swallowed by the darkness. The faint roar of the engine had faded, leaving behind only the whisper of the wind and the hum of silence. "Mum! Dad!" Baron's voice cracked, raw and desperate. "Come back! Please!" His cries pierced the stillness, but there was no answer, only the cold echo of his own voice bouncing back from the void. The air was cold, biting through the thin fabric of his jacket. Baron's knees trembled as the reality of his abandonment began to sink in. He looked down at his teddy bear, the last gift from his mother, and hugged it tighter. It offered no warmth, no comfort, just a hollow reminder of what he'd lost. The darkness deepened around him, and Baron's instinct was to move, to do anything other than stand still in the emptiness. He stumbled down the dirt road, his sneakers kicking up small clouds of dust that the moonlight failed to illuminate. Every sound around him seemed amplified: the rustle of leaves in the distance, the low whistle of the wind threading through the skeletal trees, even the faint scurry of unseen creatures. His imagination ran wild, conjuring monsters that he had only ever seen in the pages of his storybooks. Shapes shifted in the shadows. Faces leered at him from the corners of his vision. A branch snapped somewhere behind him, and Baron froze. His breath hitched, shallow and fast, as he spun around to find nothing but an endless expanse of darkness. He clutched the bear tighter and forced himself forward, tears blurring his vision. Time slipped away, swallowed by fear and cold. Baron didn't know how far he'd walked or how long he'd been wandering when he first heard it. A low growl, soft but unmistakable. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. From the corner of his eye, movement. A sleek shadow darted between the trees. Then another, and another. Baron turned slowly, his legs trembling so violently he thought they might give out beneath him. Shapes emerged from the darkness, their eyes catching faint glints of moonlight. Wolves. They moved like ghosts, silent and deliberate. The wolves came closer and closer, until they formed a circle around the trembling boy. Baron took a step back, and then another, until his heel caught on a rock, and he stumbled to the ground. He looked up to see the wolves tightening their circle, their glowing eyes fixed on him. "No," he whispered, his voice a thin thread of sound. "Please. No." One wolf stepped closer, its lips pulling back to reveal sharp teeth. Baron shut his eyes, bracing for the end, but the end didn't come. Instead, a soft snuffle, a gentle nudge, but instead of the attack he feared, he felt something soft brush against his cheek. He slowly opened his eyes and came face to face with a wolf with grey fur and gentle eyes. Her head was low, her eyes calm and steady as they met him. She nudged him again, her nose cold against his skin, and then lowered herself to the ground beside him. Baron blinked, unsure if this was some cruel trick his mind was playing. But the she-wolf didn't move, didn't bare her teeth or growl. Her warmth radiated against his side, chasing away the chill that had seeped into his bones. He hesitated, then reached out a trembling hand to touch her fur. It was coarse, yet soft, alive with heat and motion. His fingers sank into it, and for the first time that night, his breathing began to slow. The other wolves stayed back, their eyes watching but no longer threatening. The she-wolf curled closer to Baron, her steady heartbeat thudding softly against his arm. Exhaustion overtook him. His eyelids grew heavy, and the fear that had gripped him so tightly began to loosen its hold. He didn't know why this wolf had chosen to stay by his side, why she hadn't turned on him like he'd expected. But at that moment, he didn't care. Baron's head rested against her flank, and as the sounds of the night dulled around him, he slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first rays of dawn crept through the canopy, casting a soft golden light over the clearing. Baron stirred, the warmth against his side unfamiliar but comforting. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the soft hues of morning. The events of the previous night rushed back. The abandonment, the wolves and the she-wolf who had curled up beside him. Slowly he turned his head. A she-wolf was still there, her sleek, silvery fur gleaming faintly in the dappled light. She watched him with quiet intensity, her amber eyes calm and unwavering. Baron didn't move at first, unsure of how to react. The fear that had gripped him so tightly last night had softened into a wary curiosity. He sat up slowly, his small hands still clutching the tattered teddy bear. The other wolves lingered nearby, their movements cautious, yet unthreatening. Baron's heart thudded, but it wasn't the racing panic of before. It was something softer, a tentative recognition that, for now, he was safe. As he glanced back at the she-wolf, let out a low, almost imperceptible rumble. Not a growl, but something gentler. It reminded him of the hum his mother used to make when she'd hold him close. He exhaled shakily and nodded, as if answering a question only he could hear. "Okay," he murmured. "I get it. You're not going to hurt me." The she-wolf tilted her head slightly, her ears twitching as if she understood. Baron let the quiet stretch between them, his mind grasping for familiarity in this strange new world. "Zany," he said finally, the name tumbling from his lips like a secret. "That's what I'll call you. Zany." The name came from a girl in his kindergarten class, a girl who had been kind to him, even when the other children teased him for the threadbare patches on his clothes. It felt right, naming the she-wolf after someone who had made him feel seen. Baron wasn't sure what he expected, but Zany's reaction was almost approving. She blinked slowly, then rose to her feet, her movements fluid and deliberate. She padded a few steps away before turning to look back at him, her gaze a silent command. "Wait," he said, scrambling to his feet. "You want me to follow you?" Zany didn't wait. She moved through the underbrush with practiced ease, her silver coat blending seamlessly with the dappled shadows. Baron hesitated for only a moment before he clutched his bear tighter and stumbled after her. It wasn't long before Baron realized how unprepared he was. His stomach growled loudly, and his legs felt weak. The forest around him seemed endless, its towering trees and dense foliage an unfamiliar maze. When he tripped over a root and landed hard on his knees, the tears came unbidden, stinging his eyes as frustration and exhaustion welled up. "I can't do this," he muttered, burying his face in his hands. But then, there she was, Zany, standing a few feet away. She stared at him, her expression calm and expectant. With a quiet huff, she turned her head to a patch of bushes nearby and nudged the leaves aside with her snout. Baron sniffled and wiped his nose, curiosity overcoming his misery. He crawled over to see what she had found. Berries. Small, dark ones, clustered together. Zany gave another huff and looked at him as if to say, "Go on, try it." Baron hesitated, but hunger overpowered caution. He plucked one and tasted it, the tart sweetness exploding on his tongue. He nodded gratefully at Zany, who sat back on her haunches, her tail swishing lightly against the ground. Over the next few hours, Zany led him to a small creek where he drank greedily from the cool water. her ever-watchful presence guiding him through every new discovery. Baron began to feel something he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever: hope. That night, as he sat beside Zanny under the pale glow of the moon, Baron let his gaze linger on her. The way she watched over him, patient and protective, reminded him of something he had lost. Or maybe something he had found. "You're like a mom," he whispered, his voice soft and full of wonder. Zanny didn't respond, of course, but her eyes met his, and in them he saw something he hadn't dared to hope for, a reflection of the love he thought had abandoned him. For the first time since he was left on that lonely road, Baron felt the stirrings of trust. It wasn't complete, and it wasn't easy, but it was there, a fragile thread connecting him to the silver wolf by his side. And for now, that was enough. The first few weeks were a blur of instinct and survival for Baron. The wolves, once a source of fear, became his unexpected guardians. They allowed him to follow, though their movements were swift and deliberate, often leaving Baron scrambling to keep up. Zanny always lingered a little longer, her steady presence a silent reassurance. Over time, Baron began to understand their rhythms, their silent communication, and the unspoken bond that tethered the pack together. The wolves shared their kills, leaving scraps of meat for Baron. It was a harsh adjustment for the boy who had once known the comforts of cooked meals, but hunger drove him to adapt. Zanny watched over him, her amber eyes sharp and assessing as he gnawed at the rough morsels. She seemed to understand that he was different, fragile in ways the rest of the pack was not. Days turned into weeks, and Baron started to learn the forest's secrets. Under Zanny's watchful guidance, he figured out how to climb trees, his small hands gripping rough bark as he hoisted himself up to escape the occasional threat of larger predators. He discovered patches of berries, their bright red and purple hues standing out against the forest floor. At first, he hesitated, unsure of what was safe. Zanny would sniff the plants and either nudge him forward or steer him away with a low growl. Each moment was a lesson, each day a test of his resilience. When storms rolled in, their fury shaking the trees and drenching the ground, Baron learned to seek shelter. He followed the wolves to rocky overhangs or hollowed-out logs where they would huddle together, their body heat a shared refuge against the cold. Baron would press himself close to Zanny, her fur soft and warm, her breathing steady like a lullaby in the chaos. Yet even amid the raw beauty and survival of the forest, Baron's thoughts often drifted to the life he had lost. At night, when the pack settled into a protective circle, Baron would clutch his worn teddy bear and stare at the stars through gaps in the canopy. The soft rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures were a far cry from the bedtime stories his mother used to tell. He couldn't stop the questions from bubbling up in his mind. Why had they left him? Were they thinking about him now, wondering where he was? Or had they moved on? Sometimes tears would spill down his cheeks as he buried his face into the bear's faded fur. Zanny, sensing his sorrow, would nuzzle close, her presence grounding him in the here and now. Though she couldn't erase the ache of abandonment, she made him feel less alone. Over 2 years, Baron's connection with Zanny deepened into something almost unspoken. She wasn't just a protector, she was family. The way she waited for him when he lagged behind, or how she stood between him and danger, made him trust her in ways he could no longer trust humans. In her, Baron found comfort, even love. He spoke to her sometimes, his voice soft and hesitant, as though afraid the forest itself might overhear. "You're the only one who stayed," he murmured one evening, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Zany, lying a few feet away, flicked an ear at his voice, but remained still. "I don't know why they left me," he continued, "but I'm glad you didn't." Zany responded with a low, soft rumble, a sound Baron had come to interpret as her way of acknowledging him. He smiled, a small, fleeting curve of his lips. By now, Baron could move through the forest with a quiet confidence. His feet knew the paths worn by the wolves, his eyes quick to spot the subtle signs of danger. The forest had shaped him, not just in skill but in spirit. And though the questions about his parents still lingered, Baron began to feel that he was not entirely lost. The forest stretched wide and silent under the soft morning light, dew clinging to every leaf and blade of grass. Robinson, a middle-aged farmer with a weathered face and slow, deliberate movements, wandered through the dense thickets. He carried a sturdy stick and a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His cattle had gone missing again, and though he grumbled at the inconvenience, he knew these early searches often brought peace to his day. As he moved deeper into the woods, a sound caught his ear, a faint rustle, different from the usual stirrings of nature. He paused, squinting toward the direction of the noise. Through the trees, his eyes landed on a peculiar sight. Wolves. A whole pack of them. They moved with their natural grace, sleek bodies weaving through the underbrush. But it wasn't the wolves themselves that froze him in his tracks. It was the small figure trailing behind them, barely visible, hunched low to the ground. A child. Robinson's breath caught, and his first instinct was to call out, but he stopped himself. Startling the pack would be unwise. Instead, he watched quietly from the cover of a large oak, waiting for an opening. The wolves seemed preoccupied, sniffing around for prey or scavenging among the brush. After a time, the pack moved further ahead, leaving the boy behind. Seizing the moment, Robinson stepped forward cautiously. "Hello there," he called softly, his voice steady but warm. The boy's reaction was immediate. His head snapped up, and Robinson could see him clearly now, his hair long and wild, his face streaked with dirt, his thin frame bare and exposed to the elements. The boy's eyes, wide with fear, darted toward Robinson. Like a startled animal, he bolted, disappearing into the trees. "Wait! I'm not here to hurt you," Robinson shouted, taking a few careful steps in the boy's direction. But he stopped, realizing that chasing him would only deepen the boy's terror. For several minutes, Robinson stood still, his heart heavy with both concern and curiosity. A boy, alone in the wilderness. How could that be? He reached into his satchel and pulled out a piece of bread, placing it on a flat rock near where the boy had stood moments ago. Then, without another word, he turned and left. Over the next few days, Robinson returned to the same spot, always bringing something: bread, dried meat, or a few ripe apples. Each time he left the food on the same rock and retreated a safe distance, watching from the shadows. Slowly but surely, the boy began to appear, creeping toward the offerings with the wary precision of a hunted creature. Robinson never moved too close, but he spoke softly whenever the boy was near. "It's all right, son. Take your time. I won't come closer until you're ready." The boy never responded, but Robinson could see the edges of his fear begin to soften. Once, Robinson caught a glimpse of the boy sitting cross-legged with the food, a large grey wolf by his side. The wolf's presence explained much, yet raised even more questions. Weeks passed, and trust began to take root. The boy grew bolder, lingering longer in Robinson's presence. Robinson learned to move slowly, speaking in low, even tones. Eventually, the boy, whose name he discovered was Baron, began to nod in response to simple questions. Robinson learned of Zany, the wolf who never strayed far from Baron's side, and he respected the bond they shared. Baron had spent so much time alone with the wolves that speaking felt foreign to him, as though the words had slipped away with time. After a long pause, he finally croaked, "Baron. My name is Baron." His voice was hoarse, strained by lack of use. Slowly, through quiet sobs and halting sentences, Baron began to recount his story. Robinson listened closely, his expression a mix of amazement and sympathy. When Baron finished, Robinson exhaled deeply. "Baron," he said softly, "what you've endured is beyond imagination, but you can't continue living this way. You need shelter, good meals, clean clothes." Baron's gaze shifted to Zany, who sat silently beside him, ever watchful. "But this is my family now," he said, his hand stroking the wolf's thick fur. "I can't leave them behind." Robinson was quiet for a moment, his brows furrowed in thought. Then he gave a gentle smile, his voice filled with understanding. "What if you come with me to my farm? It's close to the woods. You'll have a safe place to sleep, proper food, and still be able to visit the pack." The offer lingered in the air, tempting yet bittersweet. Baron hesitated, his heart caught between the pull of two worlds. The thought of leaving the forest and being separated from Zany and the pack filled him with unease. "You don't have to decide now," Robinson added, sensing the boy's inner turmoil. "I'll be here at sunrise tomorrow. If you choose to come, I'll wait for you in the same spot." That night, memories filled his thoughts. He remembered how the pack had found him, frightened and vulnerable, and how Zany had offered him warmth and protection. He thought of their hunts, the lessons the wolves had unknowingly taught him, and the unspoken bond they shared. But alongside those memories were echoes of his earlier life, the laughter of other children, the taste of a warm meal, and the comfort of a human embrace. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Baron rose with a newfound resolve. Stretching his aching limbs, he glanced at Shadow. "It's time," he murmured. "Let's meet Robinson." Zany stood, her movements steady and purposeful, as though she understood the significance of what lay ahead. Together, they walked through the forest, their steps sure and deliberate. At last, they reached the clearing where Robinson stood waiting. Seeing Baron, Robinson's face broke into a warm smile. "You came," he said gently. His eyes moved to Zany, who stood close to the boy, her golden eyes meeting his with quiet intensity. Baron took a deep breath. "I'll go with you," he said, his voice steady, "but only if Zany comes with me. And I have to be able to visit the pack. They're my family. I can't leave them behind." Robinson blinked, his surprise evident. But then his expression softened, and he nodded. "I understand," he said. "It won't be easy, but we'll make it work. My farm's right on the edge of the woods. You'll be able to visit as often as you want. As for Zany," he looked at the wolf, his smile returning. "We'll figure out how to help her adjust to farm life." A wave of relief washed over Baron. He felt a weight lifting from his shoulders as he turned to Zany, who gazed back at him with those ever-knowing eyes. "Thank you," Baron whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Robinson stepped closer, his movements slow and careful. Placing a hand on Baron's shoulder, he said softly, "Let's go home, son." The first night in the farmhouse was harder than Baron had expected. The bed felt foreign, too soft, too warm, and the walls seemed to press in on him, cutting off the open expanse of sky he had grown so used to. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the days he had spent under the stars. The ticking of a clock filled the room, a sound so unfamiliar that it made him restless. Eventually he slipped out of bed and curled up on the wooden floor with his blanket, finding a strange sense of comfort in its hardness. Robinson found him there in the morning. The older man didn't scold him, didn't press him to explain. He simply sat down beside him, his hands rough from years of farming but gentle as he rested one on Baron's shoulder. "It takes time," he said softly. "The things that feel strange now, they'll feel natural before you know it." Meals were another challenge. Robinson's wife, a kind woman named Martha, prepared hearty plates of food, roasted chicken, buttery potatoes, fresh bread. But Baron could only manage a few bites before his stomach rebelled. His days in the forest had taught him to survive on roots, berries, and raw meat, and now even the smell of cooked food felt overwhelming. "It's all right," Martha reassured him, her voice as soft as the folds of her apron. "You don't have to rush." She started making simple dishes for him, fresh vegetables, slices of bread without butter. Gradually, Baron began to eat more, though he still preferred to take his meals outside, where the wind carried familiar scents of grass and earth. Zany, too, faced her own adjustments. The she-wolf prowled the edges of the property, her keen eyes never straying far from Baron. She bristled at the sound of farm tools and the hum of the tractor, and Robinson knew better than to try to tame her. "She's got her wildness," he explained to Martha one evening. "Best not to take that from her." Still, Robinson worked patiently to help Zany coexist with their world. He began leaving scraps of meat near the porch, standing at a distance as she approached. Over time, she grew more comfortable around him, and though she would never let herself be petted, she started to rest near the house at night, keeping one amber eye on Baron's window. One cool autumn morning, Robinson surprised Baron with a bundle of books and a neatly folded set of clothes. "School starts tomorrow," he said, his voice steady but kind. Baron stiffened at the thought. The idea of being surrounded by other children, having to sit still in a classroom, filled him with unease. "Do I have to go?" he asked quietly. Robinson knelt down to meet his eyes. "You do, but you won't be alone. Layla will be there." Layla was the daughter of a neighboring farmer, a lively girl with dark braids and a bright laugh that carried through the fields. She had already visited the farm a few times, bringing Baron wildflowers and asking endless questions about Zany. "She's clever," Robinson added with a wink. "She'll help you find your way." The next day, dressed in stiff, unfamiliar clothes, Baron climbed into the old truck with Robinson. Zany stayed behind, her gaze following the vehicle as it rolled down the dirt road. Baron's heart pounded when they pulled up to the school. Children milled about in groups, their laughter and chatter a sharp contrast to the quiet he was used to. Layla spotted him immediately. "Baron!" she called, waving as she ran over. Her grin was infectious, and despite himself, Baron felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. In the classroom, the teacher introduced him to the other students. There were curious stares and a few whispers, but Layla stood by his side, her presence steadying him. "Just sit by me," she said, pulling out a chair. That night, as he lay in bed, Baron stared at the ceiling again. This time, the ticking clock seemed less intrusive, and the bed didn't feel quite so strange. He thought about the warmth of Robinson's words, the kindness in Layla's smile, and the way the other children had laughed as they ran across the schoolyard. But his thoughts drifted back to the forest. He could almost hear the rustle of leaves, the soft padding of paws. A part of him still longed for that freedom, the wildness that had shaped him. As sleep finally claimed him, he whispered to himself, I can belong to both. 7 years had passed since the night Baron was abandoned and found by the wolves. Now, at 14, he was no longer the frightened boy clutching a worn teddy bear. Instead, he had grown into a thoughtful teenager with a deep connection to the forest and its creatures. Life with Robinson, his adoptive father, and Zany, the she-wolf who had become his constant companion, was quiet and fulfilling. The days blended peacefully into one another, marked by the rhythm of nature and the sense of family they had built together. One crisp autumn morning, Robinson entered the kitchen, his face unusually tense. He placed a thick envelope on the table as Baron looked up from his breakfast. "This just came," Robinson said, his voice low but steady. Baron opened the envelope and pulled out a detailed map and several documents. His heart sank as he read the contents. A logging company had been granted preliminary approval to begin clear-cutting large sections of the forest, sections that included the territory of Zany and her pack. "They're going to destroy it," Baron said, his voice trembling. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "What about the wolves? What about the deer, the birds, everything that lives there? They can't just take it away." Robinson placed a calming hand on Baron's shoulder. "We won't let that happen, son. But we'll need a plan, and we'll need help." Baron nodded, his mind already racing. He couldn't let the forest that had saved him be taken away, nor could he allow the wolves to lose their home. Over the following days, Baron and Robinson began reaching out to the community. Layla, a journalist who had once written about Baron's story, was the first to offer her support. Together, they drafted petitions, organized community meetings, and even contacted environmental advocacy groups. Layla suggested that Baron's unique story could be a powerful tool to rally support. "You're not just fighting for the wolves, Baron," she said one evening as they prepared flyers. "You're fighting for everyone who calls this forest home. People will listen to you because they'll see how much this place matters." Baron wasn't sure he liked the idea of being in the spotlight, but he agreed. The stakes were too high to let his discomfort hold him back. At the first community meeting, Baron stood nervously in front of a small but attentive crowd. He spoke about the wolves, about how they had saved him when he was lost and alone, and how they had taught him what it meant to belong to something greater than himself. "I owe my life to this forest," he said, his voice steadying as he looked out at the audience. "And now it's our turn to protect it. Together, we can make sure this place remains not just for the wolves, but for everyone." The response was overwhelming. People signed petitions, volunteered their time, and even donated money to help fund the campaign. The local government, pressured by the growing public outcry, agreed to send representatives to tour the forest before making a final decision. On the day of the visit, Baron led the officials deep into the woods. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the towering trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. As they walked, Baron explained the delicate balance of life in the forest, pointing out animal tracks and the subtle signs of the wolves' presence. When they reached a clearing, Zany and her pack appeared, their sleek forms emerging silently from the trees. The wolves stood still, their golden eyes watching the visitors with cautious curiosity. The officials froze, visibly awed by the sight. "These wolves saved me when I had no one," Baron said, his voice filled with quiet emotion. "They are the heart of this forest, and this forest is their home." The impact was immediate. The officials, moved by Baron's words and the undeniable beauty of the wolves, promised to reconsider the project. Weeks later, the logging company withdrew its proposal, and the forest was officially designated as a protected area. The announcement was met with celebrations throughout the community. That night, as Baron stood on the porch with Robinson and Layla, watching Zany and her pack disappear into the shadows, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The forest, his home, was safe for now. "We did it," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Robinson placed an arm around Baron's shoulders. "No, son, you did it, and the forest will always remember." The seasons had changed many times since Baron first stumbled into the care of Zany and the wolves. Now the once vibrant she-wolf moved with a noticeable slowness. Her fur, once sleek and luminous in the moonlight, had thinned and lost its luster. Zany had grown frail, her breaths labored, her steps unsteady. Baron, no longer a child but a young man with a calm demeanor and a sharp gaze, watched her closely, his heart heavy with the knowledge that her time was drawing near. "Zany," he whispered one evening, crouching beside her as she lay in her usual spot near the old oak tree. Her golden eyes, still warm and knowing, met his. She nudged his hand with her nose, a gesture that seemed to say she understood. Baron swallowed the lump in his throat and gently ran his hand over her silver-grey fur, memorizing the feel of it, knowing these moments were slipping away. In the days that followed, Baron stayed close to her, refusing to let her endure her final days alone. He remembered everything, how she had been his protector, his teacher, his family when he had no one. Every scrape, every chase through the forest, every night they had shared beneath the stars. He spoke softly to her, recounting their many adventures. "Do you remember the first night? You saved me before I even knew I needed saving," he said, his voice trembling. Zany didn't move much, but her ears twitched as if she were listening. The wolves, too, seemed to sense the change. They lingered closer than usual, their movements subdued, as if paying silent homage to their matriarch. When the end came, it was gentle. Zany rested her head on Baron's lap as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a golden glow. Baron held her, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest. Her breaths slowed, and with one final exhale, she was gone. Baron pressed his forehead to hers, his tears soaking into her fur. The silence that followed was profound. Robinson approached, placing a firm hand on Baron's shoulder. "She was one of a kind," Robinson said softly. Baron nodded, unable to speak. The next morning, under the canopy of the trees Zany had called home, Baron gathered the wolves and Robinson for a farewell. He had chosen a clearing near the heart of the forest, a place where the sunlight filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns. There, with solemn care, they laid Zany to rest. The wolves lifted their heads and howled, their cries reverberating through the forest like a hymn. Baron stood in silence, his heart both broken and resolute. He looked around at the wolves, at Robinson, at the forest that had given him so much. "I will honor her," he vowed quietly, his voice carrying strength. "I will protect this place, and I'll make sure others understand its value." From that moment, Baron channeled his grief into action. With Robinson's help, he transformed the farm into a hub for environmental education and wildlife research. School groups visited to learn about the wolves, the delicate balance of the ecosystem, and the importance of coexistence. Scientists came to study the unique dynamics between the wolves and the forest. Every project, every lecture, every effort carried the memory of Zany. For Baron, her legacy was more than the bond they had shared. It was a reminder of the harmony that could exist between humans and the wild, a lesson he was determined to share with the world. The forest was alive with its timeless symphony. the soft murmur of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush, and the distant song of birds greeting the fading sun. Baron paused on the trail, inhaling deeply as memories tugged at the edges of his mind. He glanced at his wife, Layla, who walked beside him. Her face, lit with the warm glow of the setting sun, reflected the peace they both felt in the wilderness. "Luna's den should be just ahead," Baron said, his voice steady but touched with a hint of nostalgia. Layla smiled, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "It's been too long since we visited her," she said softly. "I wonder if she'll still recognize us." They had come to this forest to see Luna, the daughter of Zany, the wolf who had saved Baron's life all those years ago. Luna had grown into a strong and graceful leader of her pack, much like her mother. For Baron and Layla, she was not just a connection to the past, but a living symbol of resilience and the bond between humans and nature. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Luna appeared, stepping out of the shadows like a ghost. Her silver coat gleamed in the dimming light, and her amber eyes fixed on Baron with a calm, knowing gaze. She approached him, her steps deliberate, and nudged his outstretched hand with her nose. "Still as regal as ever," Baron murmured, kneeling to meet her. Luna responded with a soft huff before turning her head, her ears pricking forward. Something had caught her attention. "What is it?" Layla asked, watching Luna's sharp focus shift deeper into the forest. Without hesitation, Luna began to move, glancing back at them as if urging them to follow. Baron and Layla exchanged a glance, then quickly fell in step behind her. The forest grew quieter as they followed Luna, the trail narrowing beneath their feet. It was then they heard it. A faint, muffled sound. A cry. Baron froze for a moment, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "It sounds like a child," Layla whispered. As they moved closer, the sound became clearer, soft, hiccuping sobs, blending with the rustle of leaves. In a small clearing, they found her, a little girl, no older than 6, crouched beside a fallen tree. Her face was streaked with tears, her clothes torn and muddy. She clutched a small toy rabbit, holding it tightly against her chest as if it were the only anchor in a frightening world. Baron's chest tightened. The scene was painfully familiar. He knelt slowly, careful not to startle her. "Hi there," he said, his voice low and gentle. "Are you lost?" The girl looked up, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. She didn't answer, just hugged her rabbit closer. Layla crouched beside him. "It's okay," she said softly, her tone warm and reassuring. "We're here to help." Luna stepped forward then, her presence almost magical in its effect. The girl's gaze shifted to the wolf, and something about Luna's calm, steady demeanor seemed to ease her fear. Baron reached out his hand. "We'll take you back to your family. Do you remember where they might be?" The girl hesitated before nodding slowly. She wiped at her face with a small, trembling hand, her trust slowly forming in the safety of their presence. Guided by Luna, Baron and Layla retraced the trail, carrying the girl when her legs grew tired. The journey back was quiet, the forest's gentle sounds wrapping around them like a protective blanket. When they emerged onto a larger path, they saw a group of people in the distance, calling out a name. "Her parents," Layla whispered. The girl perked up at the sight, squirming in Baron's arms until he set her down. She ran toward the voices, her cries of "Mommy! Daddy!" ringing out. The parents turned, their faces lighting up with a mix of relief and disbelief. As the family reunited, Baron and Layla stood back, watching silently. Luna lingered beside them, her amber eyes reflecting the fading light. "It feels like yesterday," Baron said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "That could have been me all over again." Layla placed a hand on his arm. "And now, we're the ones offering a way back," she said with a soft smile. Later, after ensuring the girl's safety, Baron and Layla returned to the forest. Luna led them back to her den, where the pack greeted them briefly before disappearing into the trees. As they sat together in the clearing, Baron gazed at the stars blinking into the night sky. "It's a circle," he murmured, more to himself than to Layla. "Everything has come full circle." Layla leaned her head against his shoulder. "And it's a reminder," she said, her voice tender. "Our work is never truly done." In that moment, surrounded by the quiet strength of the forest and the legacy of Zany, Baron knew their mission would continue. Together, he and Layla would remain bridges between the wild and the human, guiding others to see the beauty of both worlds. And that's a story of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and nature. It's a powerful reminder that life often comes full circle, and sometimes we find our purpose in the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a little inspiration today. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Stories that remind us of the beauty of connection, the importance of conservation, and the hope we can find in even the wildest of places. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next adventure.